Hello everybody, and welcome to the first video in which I talk a bit about some sound design that I've done. Some of you guys requested that I talk a little bit about the sound design on a few of the songs that I've put out maybe a few months ago, about a year ago. So the first one we're going to do is my track Fractal. Now, if you haven't heard Fractal, you can listen to it on my SoundCloud or on this YouTube channel. And it's kind of a little bit like a trap song with some future influences, but it's still very heavily experimental. So it's kind of hard to tie down to a genre. I think that what a lot of people like about the track is that it has a very unique lead, which kind of sounds a little bit like this. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about the sound design for the lead. So that's what it sounds like in the track, but what happens if I turn off all of the effects that are on it, the entire effects chain? I grouped them all together so that you could see what happens when I turn them all off at once. So this is what it sounds like with them all off. As you can see, it sounds very different, nothing like what the track sounds like that I uploaded. And the reason for this is I actually used quite a few effects on it, as you can see here, about 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, almost 20 effects it would appear. And this is because I did something that I don't usually do on a track, but I did this time, and that is use samples to make the lead. Solely samples, that's it. And these actually happen to be bass samples, like dubstep samples from a pack that I downloaded. So that made it a little bit more difficult, but a little bit more interesting to try to turn these into a lead. So kind of go through it. First, have a resonator. I like to put a resonator on things that are not necessarily very musical, that don't really have a good musical tone to them. I throw them on there early in the effects chain so that I can give it a little bit of a tone. I don't put the wet all the way up. I put it, somewhere in the middle. So this one here, you can still hear it a bit. That kind of flange sound is the resonator at work. If I turn it off, you can hear what it sounds like. When I turn off the resonator, it becomes almost completely atonal. Alright, and then here we have a group that I put on here. This was an old effect that I had before, a whole effects chain that I made for a different track, and I decided to drop it on there and mess around with some of the values. And as it says here, I call it soft roar, and it just kind of gives it a very muffled but kind of nice sound to it. So what it does is it kind of gives a very muffled but like soft, roaring sound to it, as the name would describe. It almost has like a ringing feel to it, and that is done with a saturator, a little bit of erosion afterwards on the higher frequencies, some overdrive on the lower frequencies, and then what is important here is also a vocoder. I don't have too many bands on it, so it's a little bit more digital sounding, slightly less analog. And then I have a chorus to spread out, spread it all out here. And then after that, compressor, EQ, just some standard stuff. This here was the width, and I don't know if I automated it. I did not automate that. So it's actually really wide here. Being that I'm talking about this a while after I made the track, I'm not sure why this is so wide, but I'm pretty sure I narrowed it down here. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll have a utility early on in the chain where I make something a bit wider, and then that gives the sound a lot more stereo depth, but it usually is a little bit too much, so then I actually bring it back down. And the reason that this is effective is because I bring it up here, and then there's some effects that get applied to it afterwards, so it affects it as two stereo channels, and then you make it a little bit more narrow down here. So it would sound a bit different than if I didn't have this at all, and then I didn't make it narrow again. Something else that's very important for this one is the frequency shifter. Frequency shifter, if you don't know what that does, it literally takes the input frequency and it shifts it by an offset value. But here I'm actually not using it for that. Instead, I have the wide selected, and if we look at the automation on it, I don't really it's not anything complicated, but what it does is here it's just normal width. So if we listen to it, you can tell that it's very almost mono sounding, not quite. But then when we listen to this, where I've made it a little bit wider, it sounds very spacious. And that's in part due to this. It also has to do a little bit with the sample that I used. Threw a little bit more chorus on there. Some EQ. Isotope Trash. This is a very good plugin for just heavily affecting sound in a variety of ways. So without it, it sounds like this. So as you can see, that made it kind of a little bit crisper. And all I did was I just have this here. I have this here on it. And then I have a convolve as well. If this doesn't show up in the recording, I'm sorry, I'll have to work on that. Right now I have it recording the Ableton application, so plugins may not pop up. If that's the case, I'll try to fix that for future recordings. But yeah, so I have a positive on the trash section, and I have intimate with dynamic mic on the convolve. And it's not mixed in fully wet, because if it was, it would actually sound pretty bad. Then I have a little bit more EQ, some utility, and then overdrive, which comes in occasionally. So that's really the whole effects chain right there. And as you can tell, it really alters the sound. If we go back to the second drop here and we listen to it without the effects chain. And then we listen to it with the effects chain. So if you're wondering how I took something that was originally so atonal and not very musical at all and made it so musical, that's back to the resonator. So as you can see here, I have automated the note section of the resonator. And if we look closely, that is where most of the automation for this track is going on. So by automating the notes, it changes the resonator's frequency to match a specific note on a musical scale. And so here, like, I go from B1 all the way to B1 again, but this is a little bit with the cents turned on. So it's plus 30 cents, plus 51 cents. Let me go back to down there. So that just gives a little bit of a pitch bend effect. But then, like here, I drop down to A sharp. So I just have a bit of that going on, and that's what gives it the tonality that you hear. So just kind of a fun fact if any of you were wondering about that. All right, let's move on to a different part of the track. Here I have a couple of operators here I have a couple operators layered on top of each other, actually. This has to do with the intro a little bit. It's like right here. There's also this one. And these were just a couple of really simple synths that I made. Not much to them at all, actually. They're almost default. Not really even that much going on with the with the effects here either. So not going to go into too much detail on those. Just this one is a sine, square. This one here is a little bit more complicated, and I have an arpeggiator on it too, but still not that complicated. So these are easy enough to figure out. But the interesting part about these is that here, if I quick solo both of these, you can hear this one, and then I actually layer them. And so if we look at the MIDI itself, you can see here, there it is, that some of the notes actually overlap a little bit. And this was on purpose. They're on different octaves, and that's something that you can do when you're making a track of your own. If you want to give it a little bit more flavor, at some point you can pretty much duplicate the same MIDI pattern, but then layer it with another instrument that's similar but not exactly the same. And when you do that, you'll get it sounding like this. And thus it sounds like a much more complex instrument than if you just had one of them, which would sound like this. So that's that. Let's see. I'd say that the last big part, aside from all the effects that are thrown in there to this track, is the drum section. The drum section on here is pretty intense. So it starts here, I believe. And this would be, sorry for not labeling it, this would be our kick section. So as you can see here, really all it is just samples that I've layered. Layering samples is really important, especially with your drums, because if you just use one, it can end up sounding very dull and dry and stagnant throughout the whole track. Now, obviously, if you have the same one stacked throughout the entire track the whole way through, it can also still sound very stale. So sometimes it's necessary on a track like this to mix them up a little bit. So like here, you can hear that all of them hit at the same time. But here you can see right here that I've had it hit here and then the second hit right here. So then it has like that double kick sound, and the second hit is a bit more interesting to our ears because it doesn't sound exactly the same as the first one. So keep that in mind when you're programming your drums. So now we'll move on to the second set of kick drums, which don't always fall in perfect line with the original set, as you can see here. So like we have one here where there's no hit up here. Now this type of layering is important because without it, once again, you lose a little bit of interest in the track. It just doesn't sound quite as lively. And so that's why it's, again, important to layer, but not just layer on top of each other, but place them at slightly different positions throughout just to create some interesting combinations. Next, we're going to have our snare section. Same story here, really. Everything's layered. Everything's kind of offset a little bit from each other. And it's nice to have, when you layer snares, especially snares, I'd say even a little bit more so than kicks, make sure that there's variety in the sound. Don't pick a bunch of things that sound almost exactly the same, unless, of course, it fits the style of your track. You want to have a very singular sound. But if you want that sound to be very full, you're going to have to pick maybe a snare that sounds like this, which is very high and crisp, and then maybe a snare that's a little bit lower, and then when they're combined, you have a sound that fills out the frequency range of this that the snares belong in. There's also things such as this one here, which are lead-ins. They sound a little something like this. Lead-ins are nice because they help whoever's listening to the track know that there's going to be something that's about to hit, and they create a little bit of anticipation and expectation in your track. And they also just, again, add some variety to the ears. Nobody wants to hear the same sample over and over again, uninterrupted. So this one is a little bit interesting. I'd say that this is pretty atypical to most tracks. A lot of tracks that you hear aren't going to necessarily have this type of percussion, but this is just kind of a very, very out there percussion section of this track. We'll just give it a listen real quick. So as you can hear, it's kind of along the lines of just your extra drum kit percussion and some hi-hats and cymbals, but it's all been affected with a little bit of grain delay here and pitch so that it doesn't quite sound natural. The reason for that is, I mean, this track really doesn't sound natural and there's nothing natural about it. So I decided that rather than having more natural sounding drums, I want them to be a little bit gritty or have a little bit more texture than normal. And again here, lots of layering. So when I open up all of the drums here, we can see just how many samples I used just for the drums alone. Now I'd like to say that I don't usually use this many drum samples in a track. Not every track calls for so much percussion, but this one I felt like just you could use it. And last but not least, here we just have literally the most simple sample ever for the 808. One thing that's interesting that I did with this one though is I created it lead-ins for the 808, so when it ramps back up before it hits again, which is something that I don't really see too much in many tracks. I haven't really used it since, but it's kind of an interesting effect. So yeah, thank you guys for watching this. If you have any further requests, feel free to leave them in the comments on my Twitter, wherever you can contact me. If you feel I didn't explain something well enough, you can ask about it more in the comments. I think I'll be doing more videos like this in the future for sure. And also I would love to do some more specific tutorials where I don't talk about things that I've made in the past, but rather something that you want to know how to make that maybe I have done, but I can make something new for you, a new tutorial for it. So if you guys want anything like that, please let me know, and I'll see you next time.